I am Ricky Jones. Hope everybody's doing well. Um, this video here came across my feed today. It's presented to you by the City Beautiful YouTube page. I've been subscribed to them for probably a year or so. I don't know, but basically what they do is they put city planning and architecture into a historical perspective. I've always been sort of into engineering as far as construction of buildings and cities and things of that nature, and it's just something I continue to look into. Um, this video asks the question, why do we build high-rise public housing projects? I'm originally from St. Louis. I was raised there the majority of my life. And there were projects in St. Louis. I had very good friends who lived and dwelled in those projects. The particular project that they touch on in this segment here is the Pruitt-Igoe projects. Those projects were torn down in the 70s, and we heard a lot of stories growing up about those projects. So before I get deeper into that, shout out to the Blue Myers, shout out to the Cochran, and let's go into this.
In the spring of 2007, the Chicago Housing Authority demolished the last of the 28 buildings in the Robert Taylor Homes housing project.
By the way, shout out to Corey Holcomb. He shouts out his birthplace, the Robert Taylor Homes, Southside Chicago. Shout out to everybody who came up in this area. A lot of great individuals.
Robert Taylor Homes is one of several high-profile housing project demolitions, from St. Louis's Pruitt-Igoe to the fellow Chicago project Cabrini Green. The demolitions serve as an admission that high-rise public housing wasn't a good idea.
Now, also historically in the black community, especially over the past 20 years, because that, I would say, would be the epitome of project living. Go back about 20 years ago, a lot of the projects were coming down, but a lot of people from those projects who grew up in the late 70s, 80s, and early 90s ended up being, very powerful people in this world. You hear Jay-Z always shouting out his projects. A lot of artists who come out, and a lot of just general good people come out of the projects. So it's been a long running joke. People try to shit on the projects because of what they became, but let's delve further into the history of it.
The housing that replaced them are all low-rise projects better integrated within existing neighborhoods. So why did anyone back then think this was a good idea? Why did housing authorities build these high-rise projects in the first place? To understand why these high-rise projects were built, we're going to have to go back in time, all the way back to the Great Depression. This is when the U.S. government really began to get seriously involved with the construction of public housing. Prior to the Great Depression, the private market was against the idea of government competing against them, but the unprecedented economic climate subdued their protests.
Now, mind you, the man said, that was 1921, he said that the private sector at that point did not want government to get involved prior to that time when it came to housing. Now, what we know happened in the 20s. Stock market crashed. The majority of value within a society is in the land and the infrastructure. Stock market crash, housing prices went down, land costs went down. So he didn't mention that, but we know what happened in the roaring 20s.
Now, contrary to what you might think, public housing in this era was not designed to house the poorest of the poor, but instead help the middle class that was now struggling thanks to the Depression. Activist and housing advocate Catherine Bauer shaped the nation's vision for public housing in this era.
Now, my question is, they speak on the Depression. If the middle class was struggling, this middle class that they speak of, and we talking about the 1920s, class was very easily separated at that time. It wasn't random millionaires and random 100,000aires. You had a whole bunch of high-end people, some people that was at least able to live out some sort of life, which usually was business owners, and then everybody else, literally. We're talking about the 20s. So why would it be in their interest to save this so-called middle class, because in America at the time, those were all your business owners. We just come out of World War One. All the young dudes coming back from the war, taking over their dad's businesses. All the women who were working in those factories and things are now getting into the workforce in different fashions with women's rights and everything. So you got to understand who they were saving or bailing out at the time by building these high-rise projects.
And literally wrote the 1937 law that really kicked off public.
Also, this was a height of immigration, Ellis Island and those areas of New York. So if they're putting all these middle class in these high rises to get rid of the slums, who we know who supposedly lived in the slums, then where were all these immigrants going? My bad, y'all. I know where I was at, though.
Favored modern architectural techniques but did not favor high-rise projects. This general approach of housing workers in low-rise buildings lasted until the end of World War II. Housing, not just public housing, changed dramatically in the post-war years. Middle-class white families moved to the suburbs in droves, buying single-family homes.
Now that's where I'm going to bring it into the personal realm. If you know the history of a place like St. Louis, which was one of the major cities of this project construction, the outskirts of the city of St. Louis was populated by a lot of blacks, a lot of farming folk, a lot of people who were coming from Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi, and a lot of people who were already there after what happened 40 years prior, the emancipation. It was only 40 years prior to what we're talking about right now with this whole 20s projects and all that. My family lived in an area called Webster, Groves, and Meacham Park. These areas were country. They had outhouses, but people grew on their land. People fed each other. They had their own fire departments, police, schools, all of that encapsulated in their communities without the help of the government or outside entities. Everything was all self-contained in these neighborhoods. All of a sudden, this rush, this white flight, they want to portray it as if white people were running away from this influx of blacks moving in the city. We were already in the city. When they moved out to these suburbs, they used things called eminent domain, which businesses use crazy now, to take homes and land from black folks. All of a sudden, your 5 acres turned into a half an acre, and they built 12 houses on your other land and gave it to people for the low.
They left behind black and immigrant families who could not leave the city, either because they could not afford homes or because white neighborhoods would not tolerate black families moving in. Banks wouldn't loan to minority families, and real estate agents wouldn't show them homes in white communities. White families were allowed to have a home, an asset that increased in value and cemented their place in the middle class.
Now, what he did was gave you basically a timeline in a few seconds, which really took place over 20 to 25 years. Because all of this new suburb construction, if you go look at all these old suburbs, they were built in the 40s, not the 20s and 30s. They were built in the 40s and 50s. What happened in the 40s and 50s? Flight. Airline companies. The cars started big building more. So these dudes got those jobs. Yeah, they wasn't loaning us money at the banks, but they also wasn't giving us jobs at the factory and at the plant as well, so we can get those pensions that we can give to our good-for-nothing kids.
Black families in the city became poorer and poorer, and the federal government was about to make their lives even worse. Harry Truman signed the Housing Act of 1940 of federal funding to cities to eradicate what he called slums, where 5 million American families were living at the time, and build new modern housing. While upgrading the living conditions for millions of Americans may sound like a good idea, in practice it was a disaster. Planners refer to this period of time as urban renewal, but for many poor black urban residents, it was known at the time as Negro removal.
Exactly. So let me get this straight. 20s, they come up with the idea of the projects. They didn't start building them yet. 30s and 40s, because there's so many black-owned homes in the cities, white people moved out further so they can take the cheaper homes and land from more rural people. Okay, because a city like St. Louis was built from east to west. There are literally places right now still that have never ever been populated that are within 15 to 10 minutes outside of this main city. There's just land. So this urban renewal was not necessarily housing. Urban renewal was what he shows in this picture right here. Highways. So those same people who moved way out to those suburbs can get into these inner cities and out of these inner cities without having to contribute at all by going through and buying stuff through the black neighborhoods, buying stuff at the black stores, the black gas stations. Here and there. You can just hit the highway and come on out.
As black neighborhoods were demolished, but only some housing was rebuilt, and much of that housing was actually intended for upper-income white residents.
And by the way, in St. Louis, all of the black neighborhoods that were destroyed are in St. Louis County. Delwood, Meacham Park, a lot of Kinlock, in those areas, Castle Point, highly populated with black folks and immigrants. Baden, highly populated with blacks and immigrants, going all the way up throughout the 70s and 80s. Gone. And that's not in the city proper area. So they want to make it always seem like it's a city thing. This is going on in the outskirts. Those highways.
The full effects of urban renewal are far-reaching and will certainly be the subject of its own video someday, but here's what's relevant to our discussion of housing projects. Urban renewal directed funding at the inner cities, meaning the kind of projects Catherine Bauer advocated for, nice developments in the suburbs, just weren't possible. Inner city neighborhoods would be destroyed and replaced with completely new housing.
The opposite happened, like I said, in St. Louis. They didn't destroy the housing in the inner city. What they did was devalue the housing in the inner city. They destroyed the infrastructure in the inner city. They closed the grocery stores, the businesses, the malls. Get rid of that, people got to go outside of the neighborhood to go spend their dollars. And then they come back, and all of a sudden 20 years later, half the block is vacant, and the houses are getting torn down, and the schools are falling apart, and there are potholes everywhere, and there are vacant stores everywhere. Like, why are these stores open? Because someone's holding that deed to that store back from the 90s, and they'll never open it. They'll never sell it. They will hold. Example. My grandmother's son, Mike Jones, my uncle, was signed by the St. Louis Cardinals at 15 and bought a house in the city. Moved his family from Webster to the city. And they had the house in their family for years. Eventually, they lost the house. When the people came and bought the house, they sat on it for practically a decade and a half. All of a sudden, they built a little mini mansion to the left of this really old, big 3-story house, and a mini mansion to the right of this big, old 3-story house. It was already on a private street. And then all of a sudden, when those houses went up a few months later, I see renovation on the old house. It's about devaluing, letting everything come to shit, and then sliding back in.
Now, nothing about that plan suggests that public housing authorities had to build high-rise buildings. They could have replaced existing low-rise neighborhoods with low or medium-rise buildings. But the architectural style known as modernism was popular. Modern architects had already developed solutions for the slums, and that solution was rows of bleak high-rise buildings. Le Corbusier was the most famous of the modern architects who aimed to create a modern city. His plan for Paris called for the demolition of the historic central city.
And you notice they had plans for the projects in the 20s. This architecture we're looking at now is from 1925. The other stuff about Chicago, they started in 21. These projects didn't start going up until the 40s and 50s damn near. Some of these projects weren't up for more than 30 years. They planned this, city planning, forward thinking. And when you're the one determining when people go left and when people go right, that must be a hell of a feeling.
In its place would be
Don't these kind of look like swastikas? I'm just saying.
18 identical skyscrapers within superblocks of lawn and trees. These towers in the park, as the urban form came to be known, were meant to serve as a cure for the ails of the city. Instead of enduring a dark, dirty place with a confusing street network, Parisians could enjoy plentiful light, air, and views in their tower, then take the elevator down to the park, located right at their front door. As the towers were identical and each floor was more or less identical, they would be very efficient to build and be able to house many people. That sounds
Now, what was the motive? We want everybody to have the same shit. Identical house, identical look, identical feel, identical views. Planning is something else. It's something about when you have a plan.
sounds pretty good, right? Well, when Corbu presented the idea back in 1925, Parisians hated it. Like, really
It looks
hated
stupid,
it.
that's why.
It never came close to being built. But 25 years later, his ideas didn't sound so crazy anymore.
Why? Why didn't this man's idea from 1925 not sound crazy in 1950? There's a thing in New York called a brownstone. It's like gold. You own a brownstone in New York? Oh, you sitting on something nice. Maya Angelou owned a brownstone in New York for decades. It was just full of books. She didn't live there. It's just full of books. When she passes, her grandson to somebody else somewhere, because I think she only had one daughter, sells the brownstone for like 2.1. A few months later, it sells for 4.4. Priorities and planning. They put us in these places for a reason. 25 years prior, someone saw that, hey, these people are getting out of control. They're getting their own ideas. They're trying to really separate from us, and they're so dope at everything they do. We really got to put something together. And what colder plan than to put you in an open air prison? I had a cousin that lived in an area called O'Fallon Place back in the late 80s, early 90s. And I would visit there. And me and her little brother, my other cousin, would listen to her Keith Sweat tapes. And as I would listen to them Keith Sweat tapes, I would look out the window and I would look across at the projects. And I'm like, that don't look fun. It's gates and fencing, and the energy is not right over there. It's an open air prison. You get home, long day's work. You gotta walk through all the nonsense. The ones that just don't care and don't even think that there's any hope. Go up 12 floors. Oh, the elevator's broke today and it smells like pee anyway. So I gotta walk up the stairs past more of the ones that just really don't care. An open air prison, and a lot of our people lived and died in these open air prisons. The next thing I'm gonna get to is gonna be specific to St. Louis. Some people know, some people don't know, but I'm just gonna throw it at y'all, and then we're gonna wrap this thing up.
Two reasons for this. First, housing advocates wanted to replace old and dilapidated housing with something better, and modern towers were pretty much the opposite of slum conditions at the time. Remember, in the area of Chicago where Robert Taylor Homes was built, many did not have private baths, and a third of housing units were overcrowded. Some of these residents looked forward to the new modern homes with private baths, new appliances, and views. In fact, high-rise towers may have been a good place to live if local governments and housing authorities would have maintained and policed them well enough. And second, modern towers can be built relatively cheaply.
Look at that.
Now, in the case of
Look at this. Just look. 35 to 55. They planned them in 25. Most of them came up by 35. By the late 50s, if your city had sense, they got rid of these things. Now, mind you, what came after the projects wasn't really no better, and it was just more of a oops, we messed up, but hey, maybe you guys will get over it if we give you this. And luckily for them, I guess we did.
The Robert Taylor Homes, Chicago Housing Authority officials strongly
That thing took, what, 2 years to be built? It's still up there.
preferred low-rise designs like townhouses for their new housing. Elizabeth Wood, the progressive director of the CHA at the time, had tried.
Hold on, was I goosing? Oh, it took, wait a minute. Okay, it took 20 years to build this damn thing, so this bullshit's still up.
Relatively
Somebody let me know,
cheaply.
Detroit.
Now, in the case of the Robert Taylor Homes, Chicago Housing Authority officials strongly preferred low-rise designs like townhouses for their new housing.
What does it look
Elizabeth
like,
Wood, the progressive director of the CHA at the time, had tried high-rise elevator buildings in the past. She was influenced by the modern tower and a park model of Le Corbusier.
Interesting.
But after criticism from friend Catherine Bauer, Wood admitted that she wasn't comfortable putting people in high-rises.
Do y'all see who built all of this? Who thought of all of this? Who thought it was the best thing ever? And they say it was for one reason, but it ended up being another thing. It didn't even start off being what they said it was going to be. It always was what it was. It is what it is. Who are these people? I'll do another video on these folks. I've written down the names, and I got to figure out really who these people are.
They instead experimented with four-story buildings that were essentially two-story townhouses
Baltimore
stacked
right
on top
there.
of each other. Unfortunately, federal officials thought those plans were too costly and required Chicago to cut costs and build high-rise buildings.
So it was too costly to build multiple four-story buildings. But we're going to build these high-rises. That's cheaper, I guess, because you're going to skimp on the piping and the plumbing. Would you rather have plumbing go down 10 four-story buildings or 9 15-story buildings? Like, it don't make sense.
The marginal cost of adding floors to elevator buildings is relatively low, so up those buildings went. It's worth noting that the federal government does not deserve all the blame. One of the reasons Chicago's plans were so expensive is because the Chicago City Council, responding to the desires of their white constituents, refused to allow any new public housing on the outskirts of Chicago, where white.
So they're saying they was building it to help this middle class, but 25 years later, these people was running out the city. So they still decided to build these things now with the plan of saying, yo, if we build these things and act like we're giving these people something, they'll stay there. And they won't come into our little cozy, quaint little cul-de-sacs. They look like trash now.
White families were moving in droves, and land was cheaper. The progressive Chicago housing.
And why was the land cheaper? Because rural blacks, such as my family that stayed in Webster and Meacham Park, had to continue to fight eminent domain and these people taking over their property for the cheap.
Authority had long advocated for sites in white neighborhoods, but the racism of white residents halted those plans and forced the mostly black residents of Robert Taylor Homes into cheaper and worse high-rise buildings. And that brings us back to the wrecking ball. The instincts of the Chicago Housing Authority were right. The towers didn't work. When St. Louis tore down the Pruitt-Igoe project in 1972, an architectural historian called its destruction the day modern architecture died.
But let's dig a little deeper as to why the Pruitt-Igoe was even destroyed. A lot of people in St. Louis know that the company Monsanto was headquartered in St. Louis County, and they would taint the water, taint the air, and taint the food of St. Louis to test out their chemicals. Oh, conspiracy dude, you're tripping. Well, yo, let's go a little deeper. December 30th, 2011. Lawsuit against Monsanto proceeds after mediation fails. A class action lawsuit against Monsanto, alleging that the company is responsible for contaminated homes and schools near a chemical plant in West Virginia, heads towards trial next week after mediation efforts fail. I show you the West Virginia story just to show you that, hey, this is a place so far removed from the headquarters. and residents of Nitro, West Virginia, where a plant was there. They produced stuff over there for 50 years, and they claimed their properties were polluted by all of this stuff. Highly toxic class of chemicals linked to cancer and other diseases. The lawsuit originally filed in 2004 seeking medical monitoring, regular tests of as many as 80,000 residents, including damages. Suit filed over government test spraying in St. Louis during the Cold War. Now, here's a sidebar of how media works. People like pictures. People don't like to read. People like pictures. That's why you got to get kids to read, and they'll fight you totally against it. Suit filed over government test spraying in St. Louis during Cold War. Now, to my knowledge, the Cold War lasted all the way up throughout like the 80s, I believe. I remember the jokes about Gorbachev and all that stuff as a kid. The Cold War was what, a 30-year span of time or something? But they show you this picture of a bunch of white kids from 1953 doing a citywide atomic bomb drill. You know what? They're all gone. Basically, what their idea was just don't look. Just don't look. Yeah, they're done for. A dissertation that renewed public interest in the military-sponsored chemical spraying of impoverished areas of St. Louis in the 50s and 60s has spawned a lawsuit. Now, you ask, what are those impoverished areas? Sanson Lauber trial lawyers. If you don't get paid, we don't get paid. This article here is from November 19, 2012, and it's posted by Sanson/Lauber trial lawyers. If you know anything about St. Louis, Sanson is a big name. They do a lot of work in the legal field as well as construction, architecture. Look it up. According to a recent report by a professor at St. Louis Community College, the United States military conducted top-secret experiments on the citizens of St. Louis, Missouri for years, going so far as exposing them to radioactive compounds. The researcher, Professor Lisa Martino-Taylor, said that while it has long been known that the government sprayed supposedly harmless zinc-cadmium sulfide particles over St. Louis, she claims that a radioactive additive was also mixed with the compound. But again, media. First two paragraphs make it seem like everybody got the business. Martino-Taylor says that she has found detailed descriptions as well as photographs of the spraying, which expose the unwitting public, predominantly in low-income and minority communities, to radioactive particles. I noticed something about other people, because this ain't just white folk. Other people have a problem saying the word black. They try to call us everything else but the shit they hear us calling each other. It's amazing. So let's go down a little bit. Despite the extent of the experiment, politicians were never notified about the chemical content, so they knew the spraying was going on. The people of St. Louis were instead told that the Army was testing smoke screens. Now, again, she found that the greatest concentration of spraying in St. Louis took place at the Pruitt-Igoe public housing complex, which was home to 10,000 low-income residents. She said that 70% of those residents were children under the age of 12. So out of 10,000 people, at least 7,000 of them were children under the age of 12. Out of 10,000 people, 7,000 of them were children under the age of 12. Also, you really got to consider the fact that it was mostly women and children, because in those times, to get that housing, they would not allow you to have a man. Also, a lot of men who were responsible enough to at least take care of their lady and some kids were military men. Interesting thing about this is that the area where Pruitt-Igoe used to stand in St. Louis, it's just fenced off, wooded. No one goes over there. You can't build on it. It takes up a huge, it might be the hugest vacant area in the city of St. Louis. Massive. And it's so bad the area around it, everything now is closed down. My homie's mom used to own a liquor store right there. Shout out to the Flamingo and damn, what was the burger joint? Well, the little burger joint that was on there too. Shout out to them, man. They used to be the business. But they were right across the street from the property where Pruitt-Igoe used to stand. And I really hope that they're okay just by being in proximity to this area that they have admitted to be radioactive, possibly. So
The federal government entirely rethought its approach to public housing at that point, too. New public housing projects were low-rise, mixed income, and integrated into communities.
And what they do
The
next?
federal government also created a voucher program, so families in need can rent homes on the private market. I think it's safe to say
they created Section 8. Basically, they created a way to put low-income people into the community without disturbing the look of the community. Because the key word was to integrate people into already set up communities. Now, the thing about Section 8 in a place like St. Louis is if you haven't had Section 8 recently over the decade, they're going to put you in a place that's in so far proximity from the city that you basically are disconnected from everything. But folk out there know what I'm talking about. Go sign up for some Section 8 and you'll end up in Fenton, Festus, Crystal City, Bayless, Wentzville. You'll end up out there. And a lot of these people, obviously, if they're in low income situations, they're in low transportation situations, they're in low job situations, which causes more situations. Finish this off. It's only, 20 more seconds.
the era of the high-rise public housing project is over. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Just a personal...
That was it. But yeah, man, I thought that video was interesting. I like to get people's perspectives on stuff that I'm familiar with, just to try to fill in the gaps, because there are things that he wouldn't personally know unless he grew up in a certain area or region. He's just looking at it from the perspective historically that he can present it, and I appreciate it, because I'll be the one to fill in the gaps. We'll all find the truth in the matter, and then we can continue to tell the story in a proper fashion. So why did we build high-rise projects? Well, initially they built them because it was a bunch of poor white people after the Depression, and shit, what are we gonna do? Oh, okay, we figured it out. We'll just go further out a little bit from the city with plans on, once we get the housing set up and take away a lot of land from the blacks and other poorer whites that stay in these further regions, then we'll build this highway infrastructure that'll further destroy neighborhoods going throughout these rural areas that will connect down to the cities, to where now we can drive directly to the cities, not contribute anything to the city other than our couple tax dollars we spend that come out of our check for working in the city, maybe $13 a check. Then we drive all the way back out to the county. We go visit our little stores. We set up our little sections. Shout out to Chesterfield, Baldwin, Manchester. Y'all know what y'all doing. It's amazing. And it's always funny when they bring up merging the two communities. They never say, let's merge the county with the city. They always say, let's merge the city with the county. St. Louis County has their own downtown. It's called Clayton, and it looks nicer than ours in the city of St. Louis. So that's my commentary. I'm just trying to use my common sense, which seems to be uncommon nowadays. I'm still here.